Plant lore, legends, and lyrics. Embracing the myths, traditions, superstitions, and folklore of the plant kingdom. By Richard Folkard. 1884. Chapter 11. Fabulous, Wondrous, and Miraculous Plants. We have seen how, among the ancient races of the earth, traditions existed which connected the origin of man with certain trees. In the Bundahesh, man is represented as having first appeared on earth under the form of the plant Reva, Rum Rebis. In the Iranian account of man's creation, the primal couple are stated to have first grown up as a single tree, and at maturity to have been separated and endowed with a distinct existence by Ormuzd. In the Scandinavian Edda, men are represented as having sprung from the ash and poplar. The Greeks traced the origin of the human race to the maternal ash, and the Romans regarded the oak as the progenitor of all mankind. The conception of human trees was present in the mind of the prophet Isaiah, when he predicted that from the stem of Jesse should come forth a rod, and from his roots, a branch. The same idea is preserved in the genealogical trees of modern heraldry, and the marked analogy between man and trees has doubtless given rise to the custom of planting trees at the birth of children. The old Romans were wont to plant a tree at the birth of a son, and to judge of the prosperity of the child by the growth and thriving of the tree. It is said in the life of Virgil, that the poplar planted at his birth flourished exceedingly, and far outstripped all its contemporaries. De Gubernatus records that, as a rule, in Germany, they plant apple trees for boys, and pear trees for girls. In Polynesia, at the birth of an infant, a coconut tree is planted, the nodes of which are supposed to indicate the number of years promised to the little stranger. According to a legend that Hamilton found current in central India, the Kadis had this strange origin. When the 5 sons of Pandu, the heroes whose exploits are told in the Mahabharata, had become simple tenders of flocks, Karna, their illegitimate brother, wishing to deprive them of these their last resource, prayed the gods to assist him. Then he struck the earth with his staff, which was fashioned from the branch of a tree. The staff instantly opened, and out of it sprang a man, who said that his name was Kat, a word which signifies, begotten of wood. Karna employed this tree man to steal the coveted cattle, and the Kadis claimed to be descended from this strange forefather. The traditions of trees that brought forth human beings, and of trees that were in themselves partly human, are current among most of the Aryan and Semitic races, and are also to be found among the Sioux Indians. These traditions, which have been previously noticed in Chapter 7, have probably given rise to others, which represent certain trees as bearing for fruit human beings and the members of human beings. In the 14th century, an Italian voyager, Odoricus du Frial, on arriving at Malabar, heard the natives speaking of trees which, instead of fruit, bore men and women. These creatures were scarcely a yard high, and their nether extremities were attached to the tree's trunk, like branches. Their bodies were fresh and radiant when the wind blew, but on its dropping, they became gradually withered and dried up. In the first book of the Mahabharata, reference is made, in the legend of Garuda, to an enormous Indian fig tree, Ficus religiosa, from the branches of which are suspended certain devotees of dwarfed proportions, called Valakilias. Among the Arabs, there exists a tradition of an island in the Southern Ocean called Wak-Wak, which is so named because certain trees growing thereon produce fruit having the form of a human head, which cries whack, whack. Among the Chinese, the myth of men being descended from trees is reversed, for we find a legend current in the flowery land that, in the beginning, the herbs and plants sprang from the hairs of a cosmic giant. The Chinese, however, preserve the tradition of a certain lake by whose margin grew great quantities of trees, the leaves of which when developed became changed into birds. In India, similar trees are referred to in many of the popular tales. Thus, in The Rose of Bakavali, mention is made of a garden of pomegranate trees, the fruit of which resembled earthenware vases. When these were plucked and opened, out hopped birds of beautiful plumage, which immediately flew away. Pope Pius II, in his work on Asia and Europe, published towards the end of the 15th century, states that in Scotland there grew on the banks of a river a tree which produced fruits resembling ducks. These fruits, when matured, fell either on the river bank or into the water. Those which fell on the ground perished instantly, those which fell into the water became turned at once into ducks, acquired plumage, and then flew off. His Holiness remarks that he had been unable to obtain any proof of this wondrous tree existing in Scotland, but that it was to be found growing in the Orkney Isles. As early as the 13th century, Albertus Magnus expressed his disbelief in the stories of birds propagated from trees. Yet there were not wanting writers who professed to have been eyewitnesses of the marvels they recounted respecting bernacle or clake geese. Some of these witnesses, however, asserted that the birds grew on living trees, while others traced them to timber rotted in the sea, or boughs of trees which had fallen therein. Bees, who favored the latter theory, writes that, because the rude and ignorant people saw ofttimes the fruit that fell off the trees, which stood near the sea, converted within a short time into geese. They believed that year geese grew upon the trees, hanging by their nebbies, bills, such like as apples and other fruits hangs by their stalks, but their opinion is not to be sustained. For as soon as their apples or fruit falls off the tree into the sea flood, they grow first worm-eaten, and by short process of time are altered into geese. Munster, in his Cosmography, remembers that in Scotland are found trees which produce fruit rolled up in leaves, and this, in due time, falling into water, which it overhangs, is converted into a living bird, and hence the tree is called the goose tree. The same tree grows in the island of Pomona. Lest you should imagine that this is a fiction devised by modern writers, I may mention that all cosmographists, particularly Saxo Grammaticus, take notice of this tree. Professor Rennie says that Montbaillard seems inclined to derive the name of Pomona from its being the orchard of these goose-bearing trees. Fulgosus depicts the trees themselves as resembling willows, as those who had seen them in Ireland and Scotland had informed him. To these particulars, Bauhin adds that, if the leaves of this tree fall upon the land, they become birds, but if into the water, then they are transmuted into fishes. Mondeville speaks of the barnacle tree as a thing known and proved in his time. He tells us, in his book, that he narrated to the somewhat skeptical inhabitants of Cauldil how that, in our country wherein trees that bearen a fruit that becomen birds flying, and they that fallen on the earth dying anon, and they being right good to man's meat. Aldrovandus gives a woodcut of these trees, in which the foliage resembles that of myrtles, while the strange fruit is large and heart-shaped. Gerard also gives a figure of what he calls the goose tree, barnacle tree, or the tree bearing geese, a reproduction of which is annexed. And although he speaks of the goose as springing from decayed wood, etc., the very fact of his introducing the tree into the catalogue of his Herbal shows that he was, at least, divided between the above-named opinions. What our eyes have seen, he says, and what our hands have touched, we shall declare. There is a small island in Lancashire, called the Pile of Folders, wherein are found broken pieces of old ships, some whereof have been thrown thither by shipwreck, and also the trunks and bodies, with the branches of old and rotten trees cast up there likewise, whereon is found a certain spume or froth, that in time breedeth unto certain shells, in shape like to those of the mussel, but sharper pointed, and of a whitish colour, wherein is contained a thing in for me like a lace of silka finely woven, as it were, together, of a whitish colour, one end whereof is fastened unto the inside of the shell, even as the fish of oysters and muskless are, the other end is made fast unto the belly of a rude mass, or lump, which, in time, cometh to the shape and for me of a bird. When it is perfectly formed, the shell gapeth open, and the first thing that appeareth is the foresaid lace or string. Next come the legs of the bird hanging out, and as it groweth greater it openeth the shell by degrees, till at length it is all come forth, and hangeth onely by the bill, in short space after it cometh to full maturity, and falleth into the sea, where it gathereth feathers, and groweth to a fowl bigger than a mallard and lesser than a goose, having black legs and bill or beak, and feathers black and white, spotted in such manner as is our magpie, called in some places a pyanet, which the people of Lancashire call by no other name than tree goose, which place aforesaid, and all those parts adjoining, do so much abound therewith, that one of the best is bought for threepence. For the truth hereof, if any doubt, may it please them to repair unto me, and I shall satisfy them by the testimony of good witnesses. Martin assures us that he had seen many of these fowls in the shells, sticking to the trees by the bill, but acknowledges that he had never descried any of them with life upon the tree, though the natives, of the Orkney Isles, had seen them move in the heat of the sun. In the Cosmography of Albion, Bees, to whom we have before referred, considered the nature of the seas acting on old wood more relevant to the creation of barnacle or clake geese than anything else. For, he says, all trees that are casten into the seas, by process of time appears at first worm-eaten, and in the small holes or bores thereof grows small worms. First they show their head and neck, and last of all they show their feet and wings. Finally, when they are come to the just measure and quantity of geese, they fly in the air, as other fowls wont, as was notably proven in the year of God 1480 in the sight of many people beside the castle of Pitsligo. He then goes on to describe how a tree having been cast up by the sea, and split by saws, was found full of these geese, in different stages of their growth, some being perfect Chopin fowls, and how the people, having ylk day this tree in more admiration, at length deposited it in the kirk of St. Andrews, near Tyre. Among the more uninformed of the Scotch peasantry, there still exists a belief that the solent goose, or gannet, and not the bernacle, grows by the bill on the cliffs of Bass, of Ailsa, and of St. Kilda. Giraldus traces the origin of these birds to the gelatinous drops of turpentine which appear on the branches of fir trees. A tree that bears oysters is a very extraordinary thing, remarks Bishop Fleetwood in his Curiosities of Agriculture and Gardening, 1707, but the Dominican Du Tertry, in his Natural History of Antigo, assures us that he saw, at Guadalupe, oysters growing on the branches of trees. These are his very words. The oysters are not larger than the little English oysters, that is to say, about the size of a crown piece. They stick to the branches that hang in the water of a tree called Paratuvier. No doubt the seed of the oysters, which is shed in the tree when they spawn, cleaves to those branches, so that the oysters form themselves there, and grow bigger in process of time, and by their weight bend down the branches into the sea, and then are refreshed twice a day by the flux and reflux of it. The oyster-bearing tree, however, is not the only marvel of which the good bishop has left a record. He tells us that near the island Cymbeline there lies another, where grows a tree whose leaves, as they fall off, change into animals. They are no sooner on the ground, than they begin to walk like a hen, upon two little legs. Pigafetta says that he kept one of these leaves 8 days in a porringer, that it took itself to walking as soon as he touched it, and that it lived only upon the air. Scaliger, speaking of these very leaves, remarks, as though he had been an eye-witness, that they walk, and march away without further ado if anyone attempts to touch them. Bauhin, after describing these wonderful leaves as being very like mulberry leaves, but with 2 short and pointed feet on each side, remarks upon the great prodigy of the leaf of a tree being changed into an animal, obtaining sense, and being capable of progressive motion. Kircher records that in his time a tree was said to exist in Chile, the leaves of which produced worms. Upon arriving at maturity, these worms crawled to the edge of the leaf, and thence fell to the earth, where after a time they became changed into serpents, which overran the whole land. Kircher endeavors to explain this story of the serpent-bearing tree by giving, as a reason for the phenomenon, that the tree attached to itself, through its roots, moisture pregnant with the seed of serpents. Through the action of the sun's rays, and the moisture of the tree, this serpent spawn degenerates into worms, which by contact with the earth become converted into living serpents. The same authority states that in the Molucca Islands, but more particularly in Ternate, not far from the castle of the same name, there grew a plant which he describes as having small leaves. To this plant the natives gave the name of catopa, because when its leaves fall off they at once become changed into butterflies. Dr. Darwin, in his botanical poem called The Loves of the Plants, thus apostrophizes an extraordinary animal-bearing plant. Cradled in snow and fanned by Arctic air, shines, gentle Baromex. Thy golden hair, rooted in earth, each cloven hoof descends, and round her flexile neck she bends, crops the grey coral moss and hoary thyme. Or laps with rosy tongue the melting rime, eyes with mute tenderness her distant dam, or seems to bleat, a vegetable lamb. In the curious frontispiece to Parkinson's Paradisus, which will be found reproduced at the commencement of this work, it will be noticed that the barometz, or vegetable lamb, is represented as one of the plants growing in Eden. In Zahn Speculi Physico-Mathematico-Historici, 1696, is given a figure of this plant, accompanied by a description, of which the following is a translation. Very wonderful is the Tartarian shrub or plant which the natives call boromez, that is, lamb. It grows like a lamb to about the height of 3 feet. It resembles a lamb in feet, in hoofs, in ears, and in the whole head, save the horns. For horns, it possesses tufts of hair, resembling a horn in appearance. It is covered with the thinnest bark, which is taken off and used by the inhabitants for the protection of their heads. They say that the inner pulp resembles lobster flesh, and that blood flows from it when it is wounded. Its root projects and rises to the umbilicus. What renders the wonder more remarkable is the fact that, when the boromez is surrounded by abundant herbage, it lives as long as a lamb, in pleasant pastures, but when they become exhausted, it wastes away and perishes. It is said that wolves have a liking for it, while other carnivorous animals have not. Scaliger, in his Exotericae Exercitations, gives a similar description, adding that it is not the fruit, the melon, but the whole plant, that resembles a lamb. This does not tally with the account given by Odorico de Pordenone, an Indian traveler, who, before the barometz had been heard of in Europe, appears to have been informed that a plant grew on some island in the Caspian Sea which bore melon-like fruit resembling a lamb, and this tree is described and figured by Sir John Maundevile, who, in speaking of the countries and isles beyond Cathay, says that when travelling towards Bacquerie, men passing be a kingdom that men clepen Caldel, that is a full fair country. And there groweth a manner of fruit as though it were gourds, and when they been ripe, men cutting him a two, and men finding within, a little beast, in flesh, in bone, and blood, as though it were a little lamb, with cotton wool. And men eaten both the fruit and the best, and that is a great marvel. Of that fruit I have eaten, although it were wonderful. But that I know well that God is marvelous in his works. Maundevile, who in his book has left a record of so many marvelous things which he either saw or was told of during his eastern travels, mentions a certain Indian island in the land of Prester John, where grew wild trees which produced apples of such potent virtue that the islanders lived by the mere smell of them. Moreover, if they went on a journey, the men, bearing the apples with them, for if they had lost the savour of the apples, they should dying anon. In another island in the same country, Sir John was told were the trees of the sun and of the moon that spake to King Alexander, and warned him of his death. Moreover, it was commonly reported that the folk that keep the trees, and eaten of the fruit and of the balm that groweth there, living well 400 year or 500 year, be virtue of the fruit and of the balm. In Egypt the old traveller heard of the apple tree of Adam, that have a bite at on of the sides, there also he saw Pharaoh's figs, which grew upon trees without leaves, and there also he tells us are gardens that have trees and herbs in them which bear fruit 7 times in the year. One of the most celebrated of fabulous trees is that which grew in the garden of the Hesperides, and produced the golden apples which Hercules, with the assistance of Atlas, was able to carry off. Another classic tree is that bearing the golden branch of Virgil, which is by some identified with the mistletoe. Among other celebrated mythical trees may be named the prophetic oaks of the Dodonean grove, the singing tree of the Arabian Nights, every leaf of which was a mouth and joined in concert, and the poet's tree referred to by Moore, in Hlala Rook, which grows over the tomb of Tansain, a musician of incomparable skill at the court of Akbar, and of which it is said that whoever chews a leaf will have extraordinary melody of voice. Wondrous plants. In Bishop Fleetwood's curious work, to which reference has already been made, we find many extraordinary trees and plants described, some of which are perhaps worthy of a brief notice. He tells us of a wonderful metal-sapped tree known as the Mesencidarios, which grows in Java, and even there is very scarce. Instead of pith, This tree has an iron wire that comes out of the root, and rises to the top of the tree. But the best of all is, that whoever carries about him a piece of this ferruginous pith is invulnerable to any sword or iron whatever. In Herneum de Typho this tree is said to produce fruit impenetrable by iron. There are some trees that must have fire to nourish them. Methodius states that he saw on the top of the mountain Gascidigo, the Olympus of the ancients, near the city of Bursa, in Natolia, a lofty tree, whose roots were spread amidst the fire that issues from the vents of the earth, but whose leafy and luxuriant boughs spread their shade around, in scorn of the flames in the midst of which it grew. This vegetable salamander finds its equal in a plant described by Nieuwhof as growing in rocky and stony places in the kingdom of Tanjou, in Tartary. This extraordinary plant cannot be either ignited or consumed by fire, for although it becomes hot, and on account of the heat becomes glowing red in the fire, yet so soon as heat is removed, it grows cold, and regains its former appearance. In water, however, this plant is wont to become quite putrid. Of a nature somewhat akin to these fire-loving plants must be the Japanese palm, described by Montanus. This tree is said to shun moisture to such an extent, that if its trunk be in the least wet, it at once pines away and perishes as though it had been poisoned. However, if this arid tree be taken up by the roots, thoroughly dried in the sun, and replanted with sand and iron filings around it, it will once more flourish and become covered with new branches and leaves, provided that so soon as it has been replanted, the old leaves are cut off with an iron instrument and fastened to the trunk. The bishop remarks that one of the most wonderful plants is that which so mollifies the bones, that when we have eaten of it we cannot stand upon our legs. An ox who has tasted of it cannot go, his bones grow so pliant, that you may bend his legs like a twig of osier. The remedy is to make him swallow some of the bones of an animal who died from eating of that herb. 'Tis certain death, and cannot be otherwise, for the teeth grow soft immediately, and 'tis impossible even to eat again. There is a plant that produces a totally opposite effect. It hardens the bones to a wondrous degree. A man who has chewed some of it, will have his teeth so hard as to be able to reduce flints and pebbles into impalpable powder. Mondeville describes some wonderful balm trees that in his time grew near Cairo, in a field wherein were 7 wells, that our Lord Jesus Christ made with one of his feet, when he went to playing with other children. The balm obtained from these trees was considered so precious, that no one but the appointed tenders was allowed to approach them. Christians alone were permitted to till the ground in which they grew. As if Saracens were employed, the trees would not yield, and moreover it was necessary that men should, cutting the branches with a sharp flintstone or with a sharp bone, when men will go to cut hemp, for who so cut them with iron, it would destroy his virtue and his nature. The old knight has left a record of his impressions of the country near the shores of the Dead Sea, and has given a sketch of those apple trees of which Byron wrote, like to the apples on the Dead Sea's shore. All ashes to the taste. These trees producing Dead Sea fruit he tells us bore, full fair apples, and fair of colour to behold, but whoso breaketh them or cutteth them in two, he shall find within them coals and cinders, in token that, be wrath of God, the cities and the land were burnt and sunken into hell. In Zon Speculi Physico-Mathematico Historici we read of a peculiar Mexican tree, called Tetlacia or Gao, which causes both men and animals to lose their hair if they rub themselves against its trunk or sleep beneath its branches. Then we are told of a tree growing in Sofala, Africa, which yields no leaf during the whole year, but if a branch be cut off and placed in water, it grows green in 10 hours, and produces abundance of leaves. Again, we read of the Zeba, immense trees, in the New Kingdom of Granada, which 15 men could scarcely encompass with their arms, and which, wonderful to relate, cast all their leaves every 12 hours, and soon afterwards acquire other leaves in their place. A certain tree is described as growing in America, which bears flowers like a heart, consisting of many white leaves, which are red within, and give forth a wonderfully sweet fragrance. These flowers are said to comfort and refresh the heart in a remarkable manner. A curious account is given of a plant, which Nair and Burgess states grows in Bengal, which attracts wood so forcibly, that it apparently seizes it from the hands of men. A similar plant is said to exist in the island of Ceylon, which, if placed between two pieces of wood, each distant 20 paces from it, will draw them together and unite them. Respecting the bariza, a plant also known as the lunaria or lunar herb, Zahn states that it is so called because it increases and decreases according to the changes of the moon, for when the moon is 1 day old, this plant has 1 leaf, and increases the number of leaves in proportion to the moon's age until it is 15 days old, then, as the moon decreases, its leaves one by one fall off. In the no-moon period, being deprived of all its leaves, it hides itself. Just as the bariza is influenced by the moon, so are certain shrubs under the sway of the sun. These shrubs are described as growing up daily from the sand until noon, when they gradually diminish, and finally return to the earth at sunset. Gerard tells us that among the wonders of England, worthy of great admiration, is a kind of wood, called stony wood, alterable into the hardness of a stone by the action of water. This strange alteration of nature, he adds, is to be seen in sundry parts of England and Wales. And then he relates how he himself, being at Rugby, about such time as our fantastic people did with great concourse and multitudes repair and run headlong unto the sacred wells of Newnham Regis, in the edge of Warwickshire, as unto the water of life, which could cure all diseases, went from thence unto these wells, where I found growing ouer the same a fair ash tree, whose boughs did hang ouer the spring of water, whereof some that were sere and rotten, and some that of purpose were broken off, fell into the water and were all turned into stones. Of these boughs or parts of the tree I brought into London, which when I had broken in pieces, therein might be seen that the pith and all the rest was turned into stones, still remaining the same shape and fashion that they were of before they were in the water. In Hainan, a Chinese island, grows a certain tree known as the fig of paradise. Its growth is peculiar. From the center of a cluster of 6 or 7 leaves springs a branch with no leaves, but a profusion of fruit resembling figs. The leaves of this tree are so large and so far apart, that a man could easily wrap himself up in them, hence it is supposed that our first parents, after losing their innocence, clothed themselves with the leaves of a tree of this species. The island of Faro, one of the Canaries, is said to be without rivers, fountains, and wells. However, it has a peculiar tree, as Metellus mentions, surrounded by walls like a fountain. It resembles the nut tree, and from its leaves there drops water which is drinkable by cattle and men. A certain courtesan of the island, when it was first subdued, made it known to the Spaniards. Her perfidy, however, is said to have been discovered and punished with death by her own people. Bishop Fleetwood gives the following description, by Hermanus Nicholas, of what he calls the distillatory plant. Great are the works of the Lord, says the wise man, we cannot consider them without ravishment. The distillatory plant is one of these prodigies of nature, which we cannot behold without being struck with admiration. And what most surprises me is the delicious nectar, with which it has often supplied me in so great abundance to refresh me when I was thirsty to death and unsufferably weary. But the greatest wonder of it is the little purse, or if you will, a small vessel, as long and as big as the little finger, that is at the end of each leaf. It opens and shuts with a little lid that is fastened to the top of it. These little purses are full of a cool, sweet, clear cordial and very agreeable water. The kindness this liquor has done me when I have been parched up with thirst, makes me always think of it with pleasure. One plant yields enough to refresh and quench the thirst of a man who is very dry. The plant attracts by its roots the moisture of the earth, which the sun by his heat rarefies and raises up through the stem and the branches into the leaves, where it filtrates itself to drop into the little recipients that are at the end of them. This delicious sap remains in these little vessels till it be drawn out, and it must be observed that they continue close shut till the liquor be well concocted and digested, and open of themselves when the juice is good to drink. 'Tis of wonderful virtue to extinguish speedily the heats of burning fevers. Outwardly applied, it heals ringworms, St. Anthony's fire, and inflammations. Plants bearing inscriptions and figures. Gerard has told us that in the root of the brake fern, the figure of a spread eagle may be traced, and Mondeville has asserted that the fruit of the banana, cut it how you will, exhibits a representation of the Holy Cross. L. Serius, in his chronicles to the year 1559, records that, in Wales, an ash was uprooted during a tempest, and in its massive trunk, rent asunder by the violence of the storm, a cross was plainly depicted, about a foot long. This cross remained for many years visible in the shattered trunk of the ash, and was regarded with superstitious awe by the Catholics as having been divinely sent to reprove the officious zeal of Queen Elizabeth in banishing sacred images from the churches. In Zahn's work is an account, resting on the sworn testimony of the worthiest men, and on the authority of an archbishop, of the holy name Jesu found in a beech that had been felled near Treves. The youth, who was engaged in chopping up this tree, observed while doing so, a cloud or film surrounding the pith of the wood. Astonished at the sight, he called his uncle Hermann, who noticed at once the sacred name in a yellow color, changing to black. Hermann carried the wood home to his wife, who had long been an invalid, and she, regarding it as a precious relic, received much comfort, and finally, in answer to daily prayer, her strength was restored. After this, the wood was presented to the Elector Maximilian Henry, who was so struck with the phenomenon, that he had it placed in a rich silver covering, and publicly exposed as a sacred relic in a church, and on the spot where the tree was cut, he caused a chapel to be erected, to preserve the name of Jesu in everlasting remembrance. In the same work, we are told that in a certain root, called ophoids, a serpent is clearly represented, that the root of astragalus depicts the stars, that in the trunk of the quiacus, a dog's head was found delineated, together with the perfect figure of a bird, that the trunk of a tree, when cut, displayed on its inner surface 8 Danish words, that in a beech cut down by a joiner, was found the marvelous representation of a thief hanging on a gibbet, and that in another piece of wood adhering to the former was depicted a ladder such as was used in those days by public executioners. These figures were distinctly delineated in a black tint. In 1628, in the wood of a fruit tree that had been cut down near Haarlem, in Holland, the images of bishops, tortoises, and many other things were seen, and one Schefferus, a physician, has recorded that near the same place, a piece of wood was found in which there was given a wonderful representation by nature of a most orderly star with 6 rays. Evelyn, in his Silva, speaks of a tree found in Holland, which, being cleft, exhibited the figures of a chalice, a priest's alb, his stole, and several other pontifical vestments. Of this sort, he adds, was an Oxfordshire elm, a block of which would being cleft, there came out a piece so exactly resembling a shoulder of veal, that it was worthy to be reckoned among the curiosities of this nature. Evelyn also notices a certain dining table made of an old ash, whereon was figured in the wood fish, men, and beasts. In the root of a white bryony was discovered the perfect image of a human being. This curious root was preserved in the museum at Bologna. Many examples of human figures in the roots of mandrakes have been known, and Aldrovandus tell us that he was presented with a mandrake root, in which the image was perfect. Vegetable monstrosities. It is related that, in the year 1670, there was exposed for sale, in the public market of Ratislavia, an extraordinary wild bugloss, which, on account of the curiosity of the spectators and the different superstitious speculations of the crowd, was regarded not only as something monstrous but also as marvelous. This bugloss was a little tortuous and 25 inches in length. Its breadth was 4 inches. It possessed a huge and very broad stem, the fibers of which ran parallel to each other in a direct line. It bore flowers in the greatest abundance, and had at least 1 root. Aldrovandus, in his Liber de Monstris, describes grapes with beards, which were seen in the year 1541 in Germany, in the province of Albersweiler. They were sent as a present, first to Louis, Duke of Bavaria, and then to King Ferdinand and other princes. Zahn figures, in his work, a pear of unusual size which was gathered from a tree growing in the royal garden at Stuttgart, towards the close of June, 1644. This pear strongly resembled a human face, with the features distinctly delineated, and at the end, forming a sort of crown, were 8 small leaves and 2 young shoots with a blossom at the apex of each. This curious and unique vegetable monstrosity was presented to His Serene Highness the Prince of Wettenberg. In the same book is given a description of a monstrous rape, bearing a striking resemblance to the figure of a man seated, and exhibiting perfectly body, arms, and head, on which the sprouting foliage took the place of hair. This rape grew in the garden of a nobleman in the province of Weiden, in the year 1628. Mention is made of a daucus which was planted and became unusually large in size. Some pronounced it to be a parsnip, having a yellow root and thin leaves. This parsnip had an immense root, like a human hand, which, from its peculiar growth, had the appearance of grasping the daucus itself. In Zahn's book are recorded many other vegetable marvels, amongst them is the case of a reed growing in the belly of an elephant, a ear of wheat in the nose of an Italian woman, oats in the stomach of a soldier, and various grains found in wounds and ulcers, in different parts of the human body. Miraculous trees and plants. There are some few plants which have at different times been prominently brought into notice by their intimate association with miracles. Such a one was the branch of the almond tree forming the rod of Aaron, which, when placed by Moses in the tabernacle, miraculously budded and blossomed in the night, as a sign that its owner should be chosen for high priest. Such, again, was the staff of Joseph of Arimathea, which, when driven, one Christmas day, into the ground at Glastonbury, took root and produced a thorn tree, which always blossomed on that day. Such, again, was the staff of Saint Martin, from which sprang up a goodly yew, in the cloister of Vreeton, in Brittany, and such was the staff of Saint Cerf, which, thrown by him across the sea from Inchkeith to Culross, straightway took root and became an apple tree. In the same category must be included the tree miraculously secured by Saint Thomas, the apostle of the Indians, and from which he was enabled to construct a church, inasmuch as when the sawdust emitted by the tree when being sawn was sown, trees sprang up therefrom. The tree, represented as being a species of Calpodroma, was hewn on the Peak of Adam, in Ceylon, by 2 servants of Saint Thomas, and dragged by him into the sea, where he appears to have left it with the command, Vade, expecta nos in porta civitatis Miraculous. When it reached its destination, this tree had grown to such an enormous bulk, that although the king and his army of 10,000 troops, with many elephants, did their utmost to secure it and drag it on shore, they were unable to move it. Mortified at his failure, the king descried the holy apostle Thomas approaching, riding upon an ass. The holy apostle was accompanied by his 2 servants, and by 2 great lions. "Forbear," said he, addressing the king, "touch not the wood, for it is mine." "How can you prove it is yours?" inquired the king. Then Thomas, loosing his girdle, threw it to the 2 servants, and bade them tie it around the tree. This they speedily did, and, with the assistance of the lions, dragged the huge trunk ashore. The king was astonished and convinced by the miracle, and at once offered to Thomas as much land whereon to erect a church to his God as he cared to ride round on his ass. So with the aid of the miraculous tree the apostle Thomas set to work to build his church. When his workmen were hungry he took some of the sawdust of the tree, and converted it into rice. When they demanded payment, he broke off a small piece of the wood, which instantly became changed into money. Popular tradition has everywhere preserved the remembrance of a certain arbor secco, which, according to Marco Polo, Fray Odorico, and the Book of Sidrach, existed in the East. This arbor secco of the Christians is the veritable tree of the son of the ancient pagans. Marco Polo calls the tree the withered tree of the sun, and places it in the confines of Persia, Odorico, near Soris. According to Mondeville, the tree had existed at Mamre from the beginning of the world. It was an oak, and had been held in special veneration since the time of Abraham. The Saracens called it Derpy, and the people of the country, the withered tree, because from the date of the Passion of our Lord, it has been withered, and will remain so until a prince of the West shall come with the Christians to conquer the Holy Land. Then he shall do singe a mass under that dry tree. And then the tree shall waxen green and bear both fruit and leaves. From Morrow, in his map of the world, represents the withered tree in the middle of Central Asia. It has been surmised that this withered tree is no other than that alluded to by the prophet Ezekiel, 17:24, and all the trees of the field shall know that I the Lord have brought down the high tree, have exalted the low tree, have dried up the green tree. Sulpicius Severus relates that an abbot, in order to test the patience of a novice, planted in the ground a branch of styrax that he chanced to have in his hand, and commanded the novice to water it every day with water to be obtained from the Nile, which was 2 miles from the monastery. For 2 years the novice obeyed his superior's injunction faithfully, going every day to the banks of the river, and carrying back on his shoulder a supply of Nile water wherewith to water the apparently lifeless branch. At length, however, his steadfastness was rewarded, for in the 3rd year the branch miraculously shot out very fine leaves, and afterwards produced flowers. The historian adds that he saw in the monastery some slips of the same tree, which they took delight to cultivate as a memento of what the Almighty had been pleased to do to reward the obedience of his servant. Another miraculous tree is alluded to in Fleetwood's Curiosities, where, on the authority of Philostratus, the author describes a certain talking elm of Ethiopia, which, during a discussion held under its branches between Apollonius and Thespesio, chief of the Gymnosophists, reverently bowed itself down and saluted Apollonius, giving him the title of wise, with a distinct but weak and shrill voice, like a woman. The blind man to whom our Savior restored his sight said, at first, I see men walking as if they were trees. One Anastasius of Nice, however, has recorded that, oppositely, he had seen trees walk as if they were men. Bishop Fleetwood remarks that this Anastasius, being persuaded that by miraculous means our neighbor's trees may be brought into our own field, relates that a heretic of Zizicum, of the sect of the Pneumatomacheians, had, by the virtue of his art, brought near to his own house a great olive tree belonging to one of his neighbors, that he and his disciples might have the benefit of the freshness of the shade to protect them from the heat of the sun. By this art, also, it was that the plantation of olives, belonging to Vectidius, changed its place. Mondeville has preserved a record of a tree of miraculous origin, that in his time grew in the city of Tiberias. The old knight writes, in that city a man cast a burning dart in wrath after our Lord, and the head smote into the earth, and was green, and it growed to a great tree, and yet it groweth, and the bark thereof is all like coals. Among flowers, the rose, the especial flower of martyrdom, has been the most connected with miracles. Mondeville gives it a miraculous origin, alleging that at Bethlehem the faggots lighted to burn an innocent maiden were, owing to her earnest prayers, extinguished and miraculously changed into bushes which bore the first roses, both white and red. According to monastic tradition, the martyr Saint Dorothea sent a basket of roses miraculously to the notary Theophilus, from the Garden of Paradise. The Romish legend of Saint Cecilia relates that after Valerian, her husband, had been converted and baptized by St. Urban, he returned to his home, and heard, as he entered it, the most enchanting music. On reaching his wife's apartment, he beheld an angel standing near her, who held in his hand 2 crowns of roses gathered in paradise, immortal in their freshness and perfume, but invisible to the eyes of unbelievers. With these the angel encircled the brows of Cecilia and Valerian, and promised that the eyes of Tiburtius, Valerian's brother, should be opened to the truth. Then he vanished. Soon afterwards Tiburtius entered the chamber. And perceiving the fragrance of the celestial roses, but not seeing them, and knowing that it was not the season for flowers, he was astonished, yielded to the fervid appeal of Saint Cecilia, and became a Christian. Saint Elizabeth, of Hungary, is always represented with roses in her lap or hand, in allusion to a legend which relates that this saint, the type of female charity, one day, in the depth of winter, left her husband's castle, carrying in the skirts of her robe a supply of provisions for a certain poor family. And as she was descending the frozen and slippery path, her husband, returning from the chase, met her bending under the weight of her charitable burden. "What dost thou here, my Elizabeth?" he asked. "Let us see what thou art carrying away." Then she, confused and blushing to be so discovered, pressed her mantle to her bosom, but he insisted, and opening her robe, he beheld only red and white roses, more beautiful and fragrant than any that grow on this earth, even at summer tide, and it was now the depth of winter. Turning to embrace his wife, He was so overawed by the supernatural glory exhibited on her face, that he dared not touch her, but, bidding her proceed on her mission, he took one of the roses of paradise from her lap, and placed it reverently in his breast. Trithemius narrates that Albertus Magnus, in the depths of winter, gave to King William on the festival of Epiphany a most elegant banquet in the little garden of his monastery. Suddenly, although the monastery itself was covered with snow, the atmosphere in the garden became balmy. The trees became covered with leaves, and even produced ripe fruit, each tree after its kind. A vine sent forth a sweet odor and produced fresh grapes in abundance, to the amazement of everyone. Flocks of birds of all kinds were attracted to the spot, and, rejoicing at the summer-like temperature, burst into song. At length, the wonderful entertainment came to an end, the tables were removed, and the servants all retired from the grounds. Then the singing of the birds ceased, the green of the trees, shrubs, and grasses speedily faded and withered, the flowers drooped and perished, the masses of snow which had so strangely disappeared now covered everything, and a piercing cold of great intensity obliged the king and his fellow guests to seek shelter and warmth within the monastery walls. Greatly astonished and moved at what he had seen, King William called Albertus to him, and promised to grant him whatever he might request. Albertus asked for land in the state of Utrecht, whereon to erect a monastery of his own order. His request was granted, and he also obtained from the king many other favors. It is recorded that on the same day that Alexander de' Medici, the Duke of Florence, was treacherously killed, in the villa of Cosmo de' Medici, an abundance of all kinds of flowers burst into bloom, although quite out of the flowering season, and on that day the Cosmian gardens alone appeared gay with flowers, as though spring had come. Father Garnet's Straw. At the commencement of the present chapter on extraordinary and miraculous plants, allusion was made to certain trees which were reputed to have borne as fruit human heads. A fitting conclusion to this list of wonders would appear to be an account of a wondrous ear of straw, which, in the year 1606, was stated miraculously to have borne in effigy the head of Father Garnet, who was executed for complicity in the gunpowder plot. It would seem that, after the execution of Garnet and his companion Old Corn, tales of miracles performed in vindication of their innocence, and in honor of their martyrdom, were circulated by the Jesuits. But the miracle most insisted upon as a supernatural confirmation of the Jesuits' innocence and martyrdom, was the story of Father Garnet's straw. The originator of this miracle was supposed to be one John Wilkinson, a young Catholic, who, at the time of Garnet's trial and execution, was about to pass over into France, to commence his studies at the Jesuits' College at St. Omer's. Some time after his arrival there, Wilkinson was attacked by a dangerous disease, from which there was no hope of recovery, and while in this state he gave utterance to the story, which Eudaemonjonas relates in his own words. Having described his strong impression that he should witness some immediate testimony from God in favor of the innocence of his saint, his attendance at the execution, and its details, he proceeds thus: Garnet's limbs having been divided into 4 parts, and placed together with the head in a basket, in order that they might be exhibited according to law in some conspicuous place. The crowd began to disperse. I then again approached close to the scaffold, and stood between the cart and the place of execution, and as I lingered in that situation, still burning with the desire of bearing away some relic, that miraculous ear of straw, since so highly celebrated, came, I know not how, into my hand. A considerable quantity of dry straw had been thrown with Garnet's head and quarters from the scaffold into the basket, but whether this ear came into my hand from the scaffold or from the basket, I cannot venture to affirm. This only I can truly say, that a straw of this kind was thrown towards me before it had touched the ground. This straw I afterwards delivered to Mrs. N., a matron of singular Catholic piety, who enclosed it in a bottle, which being rather shorter than the straw, it became slightly bent. A few days afterwards, Mrs. N. showed the straw in the bottle to a certain noble person, her intimate acquaintance, who, looking at it attentively, at length said, "I can see nothing in it but a man's face." At this, Mrs. N. and I, being astonished at the unexpected exclamation, again and again examined the ear of straw, and distinctly perceived in it a human countenance, which others, also coming in as casual spectators, or expressly called by us as witnesses, also beheld at that time. This is, as God knoweth, the true history of Father Garnet's straw. In process of time, the fame of the prodigy encouraged those who had an interest in upholding it to add considerably to the miracle as it was at first promulgated. Wilkinson and the first observers of the marvel merely represented that the appearance of a face was shown on so diminutive a scale, upon the husk or sheath of a single grain, as scarcely to be visible unless specifically pointed out, but a much more imposing image was afterwards discovered. Two faces appeared upon the middle part of the straw, both surrounded with rays of glory. The head of the principal figure, which represented Garnet, was encircled with a martyr's crown, and the face of a cherub appeared in the midst of his beard. In this improved state of the miracle, the story was circulated in England, and excited the most profound and universal attention, and thus depicted, the miraculous straw became generally known throughout the Christian world. So great was the scandal occasioned by this story of Father Garnet's miraculous straw, that Archbishop Bancroft was commissioned by the Privy Council to institute an inquiry, and, if possible, to detect and punish the perpetration of what he considered a gross imposture. But although a great many persons were examined, no distinct evidence of imposition could be obtained. It was proved, however, that the face might have been limned on the straw by Wilkinson, or under his direction, during the interval which occurred between the time of Garnet's death and the discovery of the miraculous head. At all events, the inquiry had the desired effect of staying public curiosity in England, and upon this the Privy Council took no further proceedings against any of the parties. Thus ends Chapter 11 of Plant Lore, Legends and Lyrics. Up next is Chapter 12, Plants Connected with Birds and Animals.